Sometimes life stops offering second chances, and you learn to accept it. For Julian, a 49-year-old single father, romance had become a distant memory. He'd spent over a decade raising his son alone, working long hours just to survive. When his friend pushed him into one last blind date, he only agreed to stop the nagging. Walking into that cafe, he expected nothing, maybe an awkward hour before returning to his quiet life. Then Vivian arrived. She was warm, genuine, and surprisingly easy to talk to. As they shared coffee, Julian had no idea this gracious woman sitting across from him was a self-made millionaire. What mattered was the unexpected connection forming between them, something he thought was gone forever. Could one evening change everything he believed about his future? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30, the same as it had every weekday morning for the past 12 years. Julian reached over and silenced it with the practiced efficiency of a man whose body no longer needed the prompt. In the grey, pre-dawn light, filtering through the thin curtains of his bedroom, he lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the building coming alive around him. Mrs. Chen, upstairs, was already moving around her kitchen. The couple next door had their television on, morning news murmuring through the walls. Julian's apartment was small but clean, a two-bedroom on the third floor of a building that had seen better decades. The rent was manageable on a teacher's salary, which was why he'd stayed here even when Kieran had outgrown sharing the cramped living space. His son had the larger bedroom now, the one that used to belong to both Julian and Margot before. He stopped that thought before it could take root. 12 years was long enough to have learned which memories to hold and which to gently set aside. In the bathroom, Julian studied his reflection while shaving. 49 looked back at him, with silver threading through dark hair that had once been uniformly brown. Lines creased the corners of his eyes, deeper on the left where he squinted at whiteboards all day. He'd kept himself in decent shape, still ran 3 mornings a week when his knees cooperated, but there was no denying the years had left their mark. The apartment smelled like coffee by the time Kieran shuffled out of his room, still half asleep, hair sticking up in directions that defied physics. At 16, the boy had shot past Julian's height, all long limbs and angles, but his face still held traces of the child he'd been. "Morning, Dad," Kieran mumbled, heading straight for the coffee pot. "Since when do you drink coffee?" Julian asked, though he'd noticed the dwindling supply for weeks now. "Since I turned 16 and you stopped noticing." Kieran grinned, that quick flash of humor that always reminded Julian so much of Margot. It made his chest ache in a good way. They moved around the small kitchen in comfortable choreography, Julian scrambling eggs while Kieran made toast. This was their time, these quiet morning moments before the day demanded they become teacher and student in separate buildings, before the world required them to be anything other than father and son. "You got that test today?" Julian asked, sliding eggs onto 2 plates. "History." "I'm ready." Kieran dumped an alarming amount of hot sauce on his portion. "Mr. Patterson makes it too easy. You should teach that class. Mr. Patterson has seniority and a curriculum I don't get to touch." Julian sat across from his son at their small table, the one that wobbled unless you knew to put pressure on the left side. "But I appreciate the vote of confidence." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the kind that only comes from years of shared space and mutual understanding. Julian had worked hard to build this with his son after Margot died, to create a home that felt safe and stable even when the world had tilted sideways. Kieran had been 4 when they lost her, old enough to remember his mother, but young enough that Julian had become the primary source of comfort and constancy. On top of the microwave sat a handmade wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Julian had crafted it himself in those first raw months of grief, needing something to do with his hands during Kieran's nap times. Inside it held a pair of impossibly tiny shoes, the ones Kieran had worn home from the hospital as a newborn. Sometimes Julian would take them out late at night, marveling at how something so small had grown into this remarkable young man sitting across from him. "So, Uncle Dennis is coming by later," Kieran said in that careful tone that meant he knew something Julian didn't. "Is he?" Julian set down his fork. "Any particular reason?" "He mentioned something about wanting to talk to you." Kieran wouldn't meet his eyes, suddenly very interested in his eggs. "Said it was important," Julian sighed. Dennis had been his college roommate, the best man at his wedding, and the person who'd shown up with groceries and refused to leave during those first impossible weeks after Margot's accident. Their friendship had weathered decades and distance, and Dennis had never stopped looking out for him. Which also meant Dennis had never stopped trying to fix what he perceived as Julian's self-imposed isolation. "He's got another dating idea, doesn't he?" Kieran looked up, and there was something hopeful in his expression that made Julian's heart twist. "Would that be so terrible?" "Kieran, Dad, I'm 16. I'm not a kid anymore." Kieran pushed his plate aside, leaning forward with an earnestness that was pure Margot. "You've spent my whole life making sure I'm okay. Don't you think it's time you did something for yourself?" "I am doing something for myself. I have you. I have my work. You have a life that revolves entirely around making sure mine is stable." Kieran's voice was gentle, but firm. "Mom wouldn't have wanted that. You know she wouldn't." The truth of it sat heavy between them. Margot had been passionate about living fully, about embracing joy, even in small moments. She'd probably be furious to see how Julian had wrapped himself in routine and responsibility, using fatherhood as both purpose and shield. "I'll talk to Dennis," Julian said finally. "But I'm not promising anything." Kieran's smile was worth the concession. The school day passed in its usual rhythm. Julian taught American history to sophomores and juniors, covering the Reconstruction era with students who were more interested in their phones than the complicated legacy of post-Civil War America. He'd been teaching at Roosevelt High for 15 years, long enough to have earned respect from colleagues and a reputation for being fair but demanding with students. During his lunch period, he graded papers in his classroom, eating the sandwich he'd packed that morning. The routine was comfortable, predictable, safe. His phone buzzed with a text from Dennis. "Leaving work early. See you at 4?" Julian replied with a thumbs up, though he felt the familiar tightness of anxiety in his chest. After school, he had 3 hours of handyman work lined up. Mrs. Kowalski needed her kitchen sink fixed, and the Hendersons wanted help assembling furniture. The extra income wasn't much, but it meant Kieran could go on the class trip to Washington next month without Julian having to worry about the cost. It meant new sneakers when the old ones wore through. It meant a small buffer against the constant edge of not quite enough that defined their financial reality. By the time Julian made it home, showered and changed into clean clothes, Dennis was already there, sitting on the front steps of the building with 2 coffees from the good place on 7th Street. "You didn't have to do that," Julian said, accepting the cup gratefully. "I know. That's why I did it." Dennis stood, and they climbed the stairs together. He was shorter than Julian, stockier, with the kind of easy confidence that came from a life that had generally worked out according to plan. He owned a successful insurance agency, had been happily married for 20 years, and seemed genuinely baffled by Julian's reluctance to seek the same contentment. Inside the apartment, Kieran conveniently disappeared into his room, leaving them alone in the living room with its worn couch and bookshelf crammed with paperbacks and Kieran's trophy collection from various academic competitions. "So," Dennis said, settling onto the couch, "I'm going to skip the part where we talk about work and the weather and just tell you what I came here to say." "That's ominous." "It's been 12 years. Julian, I'm aware of how long it's been." "Are you?" Dennis leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're still living like you're waiting for permission to move forward." Julian started to object, but Dennis held up a hand. "I'm not saying you haven't done an incredible job with Kieran. You have. He's a great kid, and that's because of you. But he's going to be leaving for college in 2 years, and then what? You're going to rattle around this apartment, grade papers, and fix sinks until you retire. There are worse lives. There are better ones too. Dennis pulled out his phone, scrolling to something. I have a colleague. Her name is Vivian. She's smart, successful, and she's been single for a while for the same reason you have. She got so focused on building her career that relationships fell by the wayside. Dennis, one date. That's all I'm asking. One dinner, a couple of hours of your time. If there's nothing there, fine. But if there is, he paused, his expression softening. You deserve to be happy, Julian. Not just content. Happy. Julian looked down at his coffee, at the familiar cracks in the table beneath it, at all the small, ordinary details of a life that had become so carefully constructed it left no room for surprise. What if I'm not ready? He asked quietly. What if you'll never feel ready, and the only way to find out is to try? They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of friendship and history making the conversation possible. One date, Julian said finally. But I'm choosing the place, and I'm paying. Dennis's grin was triumphant. Done. I'll set it up for this Saturday. The cafe on Lexington and 43rd. 7 o'clock. After Dennis left, Julian stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the city as evening settled over it. In his wallet, tucked behind his driver's license, was a photo of Margot from their wedding day, her smile bright and full of promise. He'd carried it every day since she died, a talisman against loneliness and a reminder of what love looked like. Maybe it was time to remember that love didn't have to be only a memory. Maybe, just maybe, it could be a possibility again. Saturday arrived with the weight of inevitability. Julian woke early despite not having set an alarm, his mind already spinning through scenarios and exit strategies. The date wasn't until 7, but anxiety had a way of expanding time, making hours feel both too long and too short. Kieran noticed his distraction over breakfast. You're nervous, he observed, with the blunt honesty only a teenage son could deliver. I'm not nervous. Julian searched for a better word and came up empty. Fine, I'm nervous. Good, that means you actually care. Kieran poured himself more orange juice. What are you going to wear? I hadn't thought about it. Dad. Kieran stood, already heading toward Julian's bedroom. Come on. We're doing this right. For the next 20 minutes, Julian endured his son's fashion consultation, which consisted mostly of Kieran vetoing anything too formal or too casual. They finally settled on dark jeans, a button-down shirt in deep blue, and the leather jacket Julian had owned since before Kieran was born. Much better, Kieran declared. You look like an actual person who goes on dates, not a history teacher grading papers. I am a history teacher who grades papers. Not tonight, you're not. Kieran's expression turned serious. Tonight, you're just my dad, who deserves to have a good time. So try, okay? For me. The request, framed that way, was impossible to refuse. Julian spent the afternoon trying to distract himself with chores and errands, but his mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. What would they talk about? What if the conversation stalled into awkward silence? What if Dennis had oversold both of them, and they spent the entire evening wishing they were anywhere else? At 6:30, he checked his reflection one final time. The shirt fit well enough, though it pulled slightly across the shoulders. His hair was combed but not overly styled. He'd shaved carefully, nicking himself only once. On his wrist, he wore the vintage silver watch Margot had given him for their 5th anniversary, its face slightly scratched, but still keeping perfect time. It felt like bringing a piece of her with him, a reminder of what love had been and a talisman against whatever came next. You look great, Dad, Kieran said from the doorway. Really? If this goes badly, then you come home, we order pizza, and we never speak of it again. Kieran smiled. But give it a real chance, okay? The cafe Dennis had chosen was in a part of downtown Julian didn't frequent, where the buildings were newer and the streets cleaner than his own neighborhood. The Roasted Bean occupied a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick walls, the kind of place that served $7 lattes and played jazz softly enough to encourage conversation. Julian arrived 10 minutes early, his stomach tight with nerves. The hostess, a young woman with bright red hair, greeted him warmly. Do you have a reservation? I'm meeting someone. 7 o'clock. He realized he didn't know whose name Dennis had used. Actually, I'm not sure. No worries. You can wait at the bar if you'd like, or I can seat you now. Julian chose a table by the window, positioning himself so he could see the entrance. The cafe was moderately busy, filled with couples and small groups engaged in animated conversation. Everyone seemed to know what they were doing, how to inhabit this space designed for connection. Julian felt like an imposter, a man playing a role he'd forgotten how to perform. He ordered water and checked his phone compulsively, though there were no new messages. 6:55, 6:57, 7 o'clock. And then she walked in. Julian's first thought was that Dennis had undersold her. His second thought was that he was absolutely out of his depth. Vivian moved through the cafe with the kind of quiet confidence that drew eyes without demanding them. She was tall, with dark hair that fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and she wore a simple cream-colored blouse with dark slacks that somehow managed to look both elegant and approachable. There was nothing ostentatious about her appearance, but everything about her presence suggested someone comfortable in her own skin. She spotted him immediately, her expression shifting into a warm smile as she approached. "Julian?" He stood so quickly, he nearly knocked over his water glass. "Yes, hi, Vivian?" "Guilty." She extended her hand, and when he shook it, her grip was firm and warm. "It's nice to meet you. Dennis speaks very highly of you. He exaggerates." Julian pulled out her chair, a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and necessary. "I hope you didn't have trouble finding the place." "Not at all. I worked nearby, actually." She settled into her seat with easy grace. "Though I'll admit I was a little nervous about this." The confession surprised him. "You were?" "Blind dates are always a gamble." Her eyes, he noticed, were a striking hazel that seemed to shift between green and gold in the cafe's lighting. But Dennis was persistent, and I figured the worst that could happen is I'd have good coffee and interesting conversation. A server appeared to take their order. Vivian requested a cappuccino and the roasted vegetable panini. Julian, suddenly aware he hadn't eaten since lunch, ordered the same. "So," Vivian said once they were alone again, "Dennis tells me you're a history teacher. What made you choose that path?" It was a polite opening question, the kind that should have been easy to answer. But Julian found himself pausing, considering the real answer rather than the rehearsed one. "My father was a teacher," he said slowly. "He taught English at a community college, and he loved it, not for the prestige or the money, because there wasn't much of either, but because he genuinely believed education could change lives. I grew up watching him care about his students, really care, and I wanted to do the same thing. That's beautiful." Vivian's interest seemed genuine, not just polite. "Do you think it's lived up to that expectation?" "Most days," Julian smiled. "Some days, I'm just trying to keep 17-year-olds awake long enough to learn about the Sherman Antitrust Act. But then you'll have a student who gets it, who sees the connections between past and present, and it makes all the rest worthwhile." Their coffee arrived, and the conversation flowed more easily than Julian had dared hope. Vivian asked thoughtful questions, and she listened, really listened, to his answers in a way that made him want to keep talking. She had a gift for drawing people out, he realized, for making them feel heard. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you do?" "I'm in business consulting," she said, which felt simultaneously specific and vague. "I work with companies on strategic planning, operational efficiency, that sort of thing." "It's less exciting than it sounds." "I doubt that." "Well, it pays the bills." She smiled over the rim of her cup. "Though I'll admit it doesn't have the same noble purpose as teaching." "I'm not changing lives or inspiring the next generation." "You might be, just in different ways." They talked about books. She loved mysteries and literary fiction, and about travel. Vivian had been to places Julian had only read about: Thailand, Morocco, Portugal. But she spoke about these places with appreciation rather than showing off, focusing on the people she'd met and the unexpected moments rather than ticking off tourist landmarks. "What about you?" she asked. "Where would you go if you could travel anywhere?" Julian considered. "Italy, maybe. Rome specifically. To walk through the Forum and see the layers of history all in one place." He paused. "Though honestly, I haven't traveled much since my son was born. It's been... He stopped, uncertain how much to reveal. Dennis mentioned you're a single father, Vivian said gently. That must be challenging. It has its moments. Julian found himself wanting to tell her more, to explain how Kieran had become his whole world. My wife passed away 12 years ago. Kieran was 4, so it's been just the two of us for a while now. Vivian's expression softened with genuine empathy, not pity. I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was. It is, but Kieran, he's the best thing in my life. Smart, kind, funny. He's 16 now, and somehow we've made it work. Somehow? Vivian shook her head. From what Dennis told me, and from what I'm hearing now, you've done more than make it work. You've raised a son by yourself while maintaining a career and, I'm guessing, not much help. The observation was so accurate, it caught Julian off guard. It's what any parent would do. No, Vivian said firmly. It's what a good parent would do. There's a difference. Their food arrived, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Vivian had a dry sense of humor that emerged gradually, catching Julian by surprise and making him laugh in a way he hadn't in longer than he could remember. She told a story about a disastrous business meeting that had ended with coffee spilled all over a client's presentation, and Julian countered with the time a student had accidentally set off the fire alarm during a Revolutionary War reenactment. Time slipped away unnoticed. Their plates were cleared, fresh coffee appeared, and still they kept talking. Vivian's phone buzzed several times on the table, but she only glanced at it, never reaching for it. Popular tonight? Julian asked. Just work. She silenced the phone entirely. Nothing that can't wait. The gesture struck him as significant, though he wasn't sure why. In his limited recent experience with dating, a handful of awkward attempts in the first few years after Margot's death, phones had been constant interruptions, visible signs that the person across from him had somewhere better to be. But Vivian was present, engaged, and seemingly in no hurry to leave. Can I ask you something? Julian said, emboldened by her openness. Of course. Why did you agree to this? The blind date, I mean. Someone like you must have... He gestured vaguely, unsure how to articulate what he meant without sounding like he was fishing for compliments. Vivian understood anyway. Options? She smiled. Dating when you're older is complicated. Everyone comes with history, with responsibilities, with walls built from past hurts. And in my line of work, I meet a lot of people who are interested in what I do more than who I am. She paused. Dennis told me you were genuine, that you'd been through something difficult and come out the other side still caring about people, still trying. That sounded worth meeting. I don't know if I'm all that, Julian said honestly. Maybe let me decide that. Her smile was warm, almost teasing. So far, Dennis was right. They stayed until the cafe started preparing to close, until the staff began putting chairs on tables around them. Outside, the night had turned cool, the city's lights reflecting off the buildings around them. I should get going, Vivian said, though she didn't move toward the street. Me too. Julian didn't want the evening to end, didn't want to return to his apartment and the reality of his ordinary life. Thank you for taking a chance on this. Thank you for being worth it. Vivian reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Could I have your number? I'd like to do this again, if you're interested. Julian's heart, which had been beating steadily all evening, suddenly kicked up its pace. I'd like that too. They exchanged numbers, fingers fumbling slightly with phones, both of them smiling at the awkwardness of it. When they finally said goodnight, Vivian surprised him by reaching up and kissing his cheek, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. I'm glad Dennis didn't give up on you, she said softly. Me too, Julian managed. He watched her walk to where her car was parked, a sleek sedan that probably cost more than he made in a year, though the thought didn't bring the usual anxiety. She waved before getting in, and he waved back, feeling lighter than he had in years. On the subway ride home, Julian couldn't stop replaying the evening. The way Vivian had listened, really listened. The sound of her laugh. The warmth in her eyes when she talked about things that mattered to her. The complete absence of judgment when he'd mentioned being a single father. His phone buzzed with a text. Vivian, made it home. Thank you for a wonderful evening. Julian typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on, thank you. Sleep well. Her reply came immediately. You too. Talk soon? Definitely. When Julian got home, Kieran was still up, pretending to watch television but clearly waiting. Well, his son asked, trying and failing to sound casual. Julian sat down next to him, unable to contain his smile. It was good. Really good. Kieran's grin was brilliant. Yeah? Yeah. Julian felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not just contentment, but actual hope. I think I'm going to see her again. That's great, Dad. Kieran bumped his shoulder against Julian's. See? Not so scary after all. Later, alone in his room, Julian took out his wallet and looked at Margot's photograph. Her smile seemed to approve, to encourage. He'd spent 12 years being faithful to a memory, but maybe it was time to be faithful to possibility instead. He tucked the photo back carefully, right next to where Vivian's number was now saved in his phone. Tomorrow he would text her. Tomorrow he would see where this could go. But tonight, he let himself simply feel happy. Julian woke Sunday morning with an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. The apartment was quiet. Kieran still asleep, and for the first time in years, Julian's first thought wasn't about what needed to be done that day. Instead, he found himself replaying moments from the evening before, the way Vivian had leaned forward when he spoke, genuinely interested, the warmth of her laugh, the unexpected ease of their conversation. He made coffee and settled at the kitchen table with his phone, staring at their brief text exchange from the night before. Was it too soon to reach out again? Would he seem desperate if he messaged her now? The phone buzzed in his hand, making him jump. A text from Vivian. Good morning. Hope you slept well. I'm thinking about that panini from last night. Best I've had in ages. Julian smiled, tension dissolving. She'd reached out first, which meant she'd been thinking about him too. He typed back, the company might have helped. Good morning to you too. Definitely the company, she replied almost immediately. What are you up to today? Grading papers, laundry, the usual excitement. You judge similar, minus the papers. Though I do have to review some contracts. Riveting Sunday stuff. They texted back and forth throughout the morning, easy exchanges that required no performance. Vivian sent him a photo of her coffee mug, oversized, with a quote from Virginia Woolf printed on the side. Julian responded with a picture of his own mug, a chipped ceramic thing Kieran had made in middle school art class that read, World's Okayest Dad, in uneven lettering. That's perfect, Vivian wrote. And I bet you're better than okay. When Kieran finally emerged from his room around noon, he found Julian actually smiling at his phone, texting with Vivian. His son asked, grabbing cereal from the cabinet, how did you know her name? Uncle Dennis texted me last night asking how it went. Kieran grinned. I told him you came home, looking like you'd forgotten how to be miserable. He seemed pleased. Dennis needs a hobby. Dennis has a hobby. It's called fixing your life. Kieran sat down across from him. So when are you seeing her again? I don't know yet. We're just talking. Dad. Kieran fixed him with a look that was far too knowing for 16. Don't overthink this. If you like her, ask her out again. It's not complicated, but it felt complicated. Julian couldn't shake the awareness that Vivian existed in a different world than he did. Even without knowing the details of her work, he could sense the difference in their circumstances. The way she dressed, the car she drove, the casual mention of international travel, these were markers of a life he didn't lead. Still, when she suggested meeting for a walk in the botanical gardens on Tuesday afternoon, Julian found himself agreeing before doubt could interfere. The next 2 days passed in a pleasant haze of anticipation. Julian caught himself checking his phone between classes, smiling at Vivian's messages. They shared small details about their days, her frustration with a difficult client, his amusement at a student's creative interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. The conversations felt natural, building a foundation of familiarity. Tuesday arrived with perfect weather, the kind of early autumn afternoon that made the city feel almost pastoral. Julian met Vivian at the garden entrance at 4, having left school as soon as his last class ended. She was waiting by the gate, wearing jeans and a soft grey sweater, looking more relaxed than she had at the cafe. When she saw him, her face lit up in a way that made Julian's stomach flip. "Hi," she said, and somehow that one word carried warmth and welcome. "Hi yourself." Julian felt suddenly awkward, unsure whether to hug her or shake her hand, or just stand there smiling like an idiot. Vivian solved the problem by linking her arm through his, a gesture that felt both casual and intimate. "Come on. I want to show you the chrysanthemum display. It's supposed to be spectacular this year." They walked through paths lined with late-blooming flowers, past fountains and benches occupied by elderly couples and young families. Vivian asked about his teaching, and Julian found himself telling her things he rarely shared. His frustration with standardized testing that reduced learning to memorization. His hope that a few students each year would catch his passion for understanding how the past shaped the present. "You really love it," Vivian observed. "Teaching, I mean. It's not just a job for you. Is that naive?" Julian asked. "In today's world, where everything is supposed to be about career advancement and maximizing income, it's refreshing." She paused to examine a display of golden mums, their petals catching the afternoon light. "I spend most of my time with people who measure everything in quarterly returns and profit margins. Someone who cares about something beyond the bottom line, that matters." Julian noticed the way she'd phrased it, deflecting attention from her own work. "What about you? Do you love what you do?" Vivian considered the question as they resumed walking. "I'm good at it. I find it intellectually engaging. But love?" She shook her head. "I don't know if I'd use that word. It's more like I built something and now I'm responsible for maintaining it. There's satisfaction in that, but it's not the same as passion. You built something." Julian picked up on the phrasing. "Your own company?" "Something like that." Vivian's tone suggested she didn't want to elaborate, and Julian respected the boundary. "Tell me about Kieran. What's he like?" The question opened a floodgate. Julian talked about his son's quick mind, his terrible jokes, his kindness toward others. He described their morning routines and evening conversations, the way Kieran had stepped up when things were difficult, without ever complaining about what he'd lost. "He sounds remarkable," Vivian said softly. "You've done an incredible job with him." "I've tried, some days better than others." They found a bench overlooking a small pond where ducks glided across the water. Sitting beside her, Julian was acutely aware of the small space between them, the way Vivian's shoulder almost touched his. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian turned to face him. "And please be honest." Julian's stomach tightened. "Okay, are you comfortable with this? With us? Whatever this is becoming? Because I need you to know that I'm not looking for anything casual. I'm too old for games, and my time is too valuable to waste on something that's just pleasant." The directness should have been intimidating, but instead, Julian found it clarifying. "I'm not looking for casual either. To be honest, I'm terrified. I haven't done this in so long, and I don't know if I remember how, but I want to try." Vivian smiled, reaching over to take his hand. Her fingers were warm, her grip confident. "That's all I needed to hear." They sat like that for a while, hands clasped, watching the ducks and the late afternoon light filtering through the trees. Julian couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this present, this aware of a single moment's potential. "I should probably tell you," Vivian said eventually, "that my work can be demanding. There are times when I'll have to cancel plans or be distracted by my phone. I don't want that to blindside you. I appreciate the warning." Julian squeezed her hand gently. "And I should tell you that Kieran comes first, always. If that's a problem, it's not a problem. It's one of the things I admire about you." Vivian turned to look at him directly. "You're a good father, Julian. That's not something to apologize for." As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the garden, they walked back toward the entrance. At the gate, Vivian pulled a small envelope from her purse. "What's this?" Julian asked. "Just a note. Read it later." She kissed his cheek, lingering a moment longer than she had before. "Thank you for today." Julian waited until he was on the subway home before opening the envelope. Inside was a simple card with Vivian's handwriting. "Thank you for being exactly who you are." Let's not wait so long for the next time. V. He tucked the note carefully into his wallet, right next to Margot's photograph, and allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved this second chance at happiness. By Friday, Julian and Vivian had settled into a rhythm of daily communication that felt as natural as breathing. They texted throughout the day, called each other in the evenings after Kieran had gone to bed, and made plans for the weekend with an ease that surprised Julian. The anxiety he'd expected, the constant worry about whether he was doing this right, had given way to something steadier. Saturday morning arrived with Kieran unusually focused on his appearance, changing shirts 3 times before settling on a dark blue button-down. "You're nervous," Julian observed, amused. "I'm meeting your girlfriend for the first time." "Of course I'm nervous." And Kieran examined himself in the mirror, then turned to Julian. "What if she doesn't like me? She'll like you. But more importantly, what if you don't like her?" Kieran paused, considering this. "Do you really care what I think?" "More than anything." Julian sat on the edge of Kieran's bed. "If you're not comfortable with this, we'll figure something else out. Your opinion matters." "That's a lot of pressure, Dad." "Welcome to being part of a team." They'd agreed to meet Vivian for lunch at a casual place near the apartment, a diner that served breakfast all day and had been their go-to spot for years. Julian wanted Kieran to feel comfortable, to be on familiar ground for this first meeting. Vivian was already there when they arrived, seated in a booth by the window. She stood as they approached, and Julian saw her taking in Kieran with genuine interest rather than the forced enthusiasm some people affected around teenagers. "You must be Kieran," she said, extending her hand. "I've heard so many good things about you." Kieran shook her hand, and Julian could see him evaluating her, measuring her against whatever standard he'd constructed. "Nice to meet you." They settled into the booth, Julian and Kieran on one side, Vivian across from them. The server brought menus, though Julian and Kieran barely glanced at theirs, already knowing what they'd order. "Your dad tells me you're interested in engineering," Vivian said after they'd ordered, diving straight past small talk into actual conversation. "Mechanical engineering, yeah." Kieran's posture relaxed slightly. "I like understanding how things work, building stuff. Dad says I've been taking things apart since I could hold a screwdriver." "And putting them back together?" Vivian asked with a slight smile. "Most of the time," Kieran grinned. "There was this incident with a vacuum cleaner when I was 7. "We don't talk about the vacuum cleaner," Julian interjected, making Vivian laugh. The conversation flowed more easily than Julian had dared hope. Vivian asked Kieran about school, about his college plans, about the robotics club he'd mentioned to Julian. She listened with the same focused attention she'd given Julian on their dates, treating Kieran like an adult worth engaging rather than a child to be patronized. "What about you?" Kieran asked with the bluntness only teenagers could pull off. "What do you do? Dad's been weirdly vague about it." Vivian glanced at Julian, amusement in her eyes. "Has he? I work in investment management. I run a firm that helps other companies make strategic decisions about their resources." "So you're like a consultant?" "Something like that." Vivian took a sip of her coffee. "It's less exciting than it sounds. Lots of spreadsheets and meetings. But you must be good at it," Kieran pressed. "To run your own firm. I've been fortunate." Vivian's deflection was smooth but noticeable. "What about you? Have you thought about which schools you want to apply to?" They talked about colleges, about Kieran's interest in MIT and Caltech, about the anxiety of applications looming in his near future. Julian watched the interaction with something close to wonder. Vivian wasn't trying too hard, wasn't performing enthusiasm she didn't feel. She was simply present, engaged, treating this lunch as important because it was important to Julian. After they'd finished eating and were lingering over coffee, Kieran had recently decided he was a coffee person now. Vivian excused herself to take a phone call that had been buzzing insistently. "So," Julian asked once they were alone. "Verdict?" Kieran watched Vivian through the window, pacing outside with her phone pressed to her ear. "She's not what I expected." "Is that good or bad?" good, I think. Kieran turned back to his father. She actually listens, and she didn't talk to me like I'm a kid. I appreciate that. She likes you too, I can tell. How? The way she looks at you when you're talking? Like she's genuinely interested in what you have to say. Julian paused. She treats you with respect. That matters to me. Vivian returned a few minutes later, apologetic. Sorry about that. Work crisis that apparently couldn't wait. Everything okay? Julian asked. Nothing I can't handle, Monday. She settled back into the booth. Where were we? They spent another hour together. The conversation ranging from music to movies to Kieran's terrible jokes that somehow always made Vivian laugh. When they finally left the diner, Kieran announced he was meeting friends at the library for a study group. It was really nice meeting you, he told Vivian, and Julian could hear the sincerity in his voice. You too, Kieran? Good luck with that physics test your dad mentioned. After Kieran left, Julian and Vivian walked slowly back toward where she'd parked her car, neither of them in a hurry to end the afternoon. He's wonderful, Vivian said. You've raised an incredible person. He made it easy. Julian found himself standing closer to her than he had before, comfortable with the proximity. Thank you for today. I know meeting the kid on the third date is probably fast. Fourth date, technically. Vivian counted on her fingers. Coffee, gardens, phone conversation Thursday night, that counts, and today. You're counting the phone call? 2 hours of conversation about everything from your childhood in Ohio to my disastrous attempts at learning pottery. That's definitely a date. She turned to face him fully. And for the record, I'm glad we didn't wait. Kieran is part of your life. I wanted to know him. Julian pulled a worn paperback from his jacket pocket, one he'd been carrying all day. I wanted to give you this. It's my favorite book, has been since college. I thought you might enjoy it. Vivian took the book carefully, examining the creased spine and dog-eared pages, the things they carried. Tim O'Brien. It's about memory and truth, and how we carry our past with us. Julian felt suddenly vulnerable, offering this piece of himself. Some of the pages are marked, passages I come back to when I need to remember something important. Thank you. Vivian held the book like it was precious. I'll take good care of it. And I'll actually read it, not just put it on a shelf. I know you will. They stood there on the sidewalk, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, and Julian felt the same sense of rightness he'd experienced in the botanical gardens. This woman, this unexpected connection, felt less like a disruption to his carefully ordered life, and more like a missing piece he hadn't known he'd been seeking. Same time next week? Vivian asked. Maybe Kieran could join us again? I'd like to get to know him better. He'd like that too. Julian reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I'd like that. Vivian kissed him then, a real kiss this time, soft and unhurried and full of promise. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. Go home, Julian. Spend the evening with your son. I'll call you tonight. He watched her drive away, his heart full of something that felt dangerously close to hope. On the walk home, he pulled out his phone and found a text from Kieran waiting. She's great. Dad, don't screw this up. Julian smiled and typed back, doing my best. That evening, over leftover pizza and a movie Kieran had picked, his son turned to him during a quiet moment. I'm happy for you, Kieran said simply. Mom would be too. The words settled something in Julian's chest that had been unsettled for 12 years. Permission he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for, from the one person whose opinion mattered most. Thank you, Julian said quietly. That means everything. Later, after Kieran had gone to bed, Julian's phone rang. Vivian's name lit up the screen, and he answered with a smile already forming. Hi, she said, and in that single word he could hear her own smile. Hi yourself. They talked until nearly midnight, about nothing and everything, building the foundation of something that felt increasingly solid with each passing day. 3 weeks into whatever this was becoming, Vivian invited Julian to her place for dinner. She'd offered to cook, a gesture that felt significant in its domesticity. Julian had accepted immediately, then spent the following days second-guessing himself. The address she'd given him led to a building in a part of downtown he rarely visited, where doormen stood at attention, and the lobby gleamed with marble and polished brass. Julian felt acutely aware of his worn jacket and scuffed shoes as he approached the desk. "I'm here to see Vivian Castellano," he said. And even saying her full name in this context made him realize how little he actually knew about her life. The doorman checked his list and nodded. 23rd floor? She's expecting you." The elevator was mirrored and silent, rising so smoothly Julian barely felt the movement. When the doors opened directly into a penthouse foyer, his stomach dropped. This wasn't just nice. This was wealth on a scale he'd only seen in movies. Vivian appeared from around a corner, wearing jeans and a simple white shirt, her hair pulled back casually. She looked the same as she always did, warm, genuine, completely herself. But the context changed everything. "You found it," she said, smiling as she approached to kiss his cheek. "Come in. I'm just finishing up the sauce." Julian followed her through the foyer into an open living space that seemed to stretch on forever. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, the lights just beginning to twinkle as evening settled. The furniture was modern but comfortable, the art on the walls probably worth more than his annual salary. Everything spoke of taste and resources far beyond his understanding. Julian struggled for words that didn't sound insulting. "It's beautiful." "It's too big," Vivian said with a slight shrug. "But the view sold me. Would you like some wine?" I opened a bottle to breathe. She led him into a kitchen that looked like something from a magazine, all clean lines and expensive appliances. Yet despite the obvious cost of everything around them, Vivian moved through the space with the same ease she'd shown at the diner, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator and checking something on the stove. "I hope you like pasta," she said. "It's about the only thing I can cook well. My mother's recipe. She insisted I learn at least one proper meal before I left home." Julian accepted the wine glass she offered, trying to reconcile the woman he'd come to know with the obvious wealth surrounding them. "Your mother sounds wise." She was practical. "I knew I'd be too stubborn to hire a chef, even if I could afford one." Vivian stirred the sauce, then turned to face him fully. "You're quiet. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. He gestured vaguely at their surroundings. "This is a lot to take in. I should have prepared you better." Vivian set down her spoon, her expression apologetic. "I didn't want the money to be what you saw first. I wanted you to know me before you knew about all this." "Investment management," Julian said slowly. "You run a firm?" That was probably an understatement. "Probably." Vivian leaned against the counter, watching him carefully. "I started the company 15 years ago, with money I'd saved, working 80-hour weeks at someone else's firm. We do well, very well. I won't apologize for my success, but I also don't want it to be the thing that defines me to you." Julian took a sip of wine, which probably cost more than he wanted to know, and tried to sort through the tangle of emotions. He wasn't angry, she hadn't lied to him. But the scale of the difference between their lives suddenly felt enormous. "I'm not upset," he said finally. "I'm just realizing how different our worlds are." "Are they?" Vivian moved closer. "Because from where I'm standing, we both work hard, we both value family, and we both appreciate things that have nothing to do with price tags. The numbers in my bank account don't change who I am any more than the numbers in yours change who you are." Easy to say when you have the numbers. The words came out sharper than he'd intended, and Vivian flinched slightly. Julian immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "That wasn't fair." "No, you're right." Vivian crossed her arms, not defensively but thoughtfully. "I do have privilege, a lot of it. But I also remember what it was like not to have it. My parents came here with nothing, literally nothing. My father worked construction. My mother cleaned houses. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with 7 people. I put myself through college on scholarships and student loans I only finished paying off 5 years ago." Julian studied her face, seeing something he'd missed before, the determination, the drive of someone who'd built rather than inherited. I'm not trying to compare struggles, Vivian continued. What you've been through raising Kieran alone, I can't imagine how hard that's been. But I do understand working for everything you have. And I understand that money changes circumstances, not character. My parents taught me that. She turned back to the stove, adjusting the heat under the pasta water. On the shelf near the refrigerator, Julian noticed a framed photograph, a younger Vivian with an older couple, all three of them smiling in front of a modest house. The woman had Vivian's eyes, the man her determined jaw. "Your parents?" he asked. "Both gone now. Dad had a heart attack 8 years ago. Mom followed 2 years later. Cancer." Vivian's voice carried the weight of old grief. "They never got to enjoy what I built. That's my biggest regret." Julian moved to stand beside her, understanding settling over him. "They would have been proud of you. Maybe. They definitely would have liked you." Vivian glanced at him, a small smile returning. "Dad always said the measure of a person was how they treated others when they had nothing to gain from it. You've spent 12 years putting your son first, sacrificing your own comfort and happiness to give him stability. That's character. I just did what needed to be done." "Exactly." Vivian turned off the stove and faced him fully. "That's who you are. And this," she gestured at the apartment around them, "is just where I live. It's not who I am." Julian wanted to believe her, wanted to push past the instinctive discomfort of their different circumstances. Because she was right. In the ways that mattered, they shared the same values. Work ethic, family loyalty, a belief that success meant more than accumulation. "I need you to know something," he said carefully. "I can't offer you what you're used to. Nice restaurants, expensive trips, any of that. My life is modest because it has to be. I'm not ashamed of that, but I also don't want you to feel like you're settling." Vivian reached up and cupped his face in her hands, making him look at her directly. "Julian, the men I've dated with money were boring. They talked about their portfolios and their vacation homes and their networking connections. They saw me as an accessory or a competitor, never as a person. You see me. You listen when I talk. You laugh at my bad jokes, and you share your favorite book with me. And you introduced me to your son because he matters more to you than anything else. That's not settling. That's finding something real." The sincerity in her voice cut through his anxiety, leaving something softer in its place. "Okay," he said quietly. Okay. Vivian smiled, her hands still warm against his face. "I'm choosing to trust this. To trust you. It's scary as hell, but I'm doing it anyway." "Good." She kissed him softly, then pulled back with a mischievous look. "Now help me drain this pasta before I burn the garlic bread." They cooked together in the enormous kitchen, Vivian directing while Julian followed instructions. And slowly, the apartment stopped feeling like foreign territory. It was just a space where someone he cared about lived, nothing more complicated than that. Over dinner at her dining table, which seated 12 but felt intimate with just the two of them, they talked about safer subjects. Kieran's upcoming robotics competition, a difficult project Vivian was managing. The book Julian had lent her, which she'd already half finished. "You marked a passage about carrying the weight of the past," Vivian said, refilling their wine glasses. "It stuck with me. This idea that we carry our history everywhere, that it shapes who we become." Margot loved that book, Julian admitted. She said it helped her understand why I was the way I was. Her family was all present-focused. What's happening now? What's coming next? But I've always been the person who remembers everything, who can't help but see how the past connects to the present. That's what makes you a good teacher, maybe. Or maybe it's what makes me stubborn about letting go. Vivian was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You're allowed to have a past and a future. They don't cancel each other out." The observation was so gentle, so understanding, that Julian felt something release in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying since Margot died. Julian woke in unfamiliar softness, disoriented for a moment, before remembering where he was. Vivian's bedroom faced east, and morning light streamed through gauzy curtains, painting everything in warm gold. Beside him, Vivian still slept. Her hair spread across the pillow, one hand curled near her face. They talked until nearly midnight, the conversation flowing as easily as it always did. When Vivian had suggested he stay rather than take the late subway home, Julian had hesitated only a moment before agreeing. Kieran was staying overnight at his friend's house for a gaming marathon, and the thought of leaving this space, this warmth, had felt impossible. Now, watching Vivian sleep, Julian felt the weight of what was happening settle over him. This wasn't casual anymore. Maybe it never had been. This was the kind of connection that changed things, that required decisions and vulnerability and trust. Vivian's eyes opened slowly, focusing on him with a sleepy smile. "Morning, morning." Julian reached over to brush hair from her face. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. I'm naturally an early riser." "Hazard of the job." She stretched, then settled closer to him. "Coffee?" "That sounds perfect." They moved to the kitchen together, Vivian in an oversized shirt and Julian in his clothes from the night before. And the domesticity of it, the ease of moving around each other, the comfortable silence, felt both new and remarkably natural. Over coffee and toast at her kitchen island, Vivian seemed to come to some internal decision. "I want to tell you something," she said, "about how I got here to all this." She gestured vaguely at the apartment around them. "Not because I'm trying to prove anything, but because I want you to understand." Julian listened as she talked about her childhood in a cramped apartment in Queens, sharing a bedroom with her two sisters. Her father leaving for work at 5 in the morning, coming home after dark with concrete dust in his hair. Her mother taking cleaning jobs in Manhattan, traveling 2 hours each way to scrub toilets in the apartments of people who never learned her name. "I was good at math," Vivian said. "Really good. My high school counselor pushed me to apply for scholarships, convinced me I could go to college, even though no one in my family ever had. I got into NYU on a full ride, studied economics and finance." She described working 3 part-time jobs while maintaining her grades, graduating at the top of her class, landing a position at an investment firm where she quickly realized she was smarter than most of the men making twice her salary. "I saved everything. Lived with roommates in a studio apartment, ate ramen for dinner most nights, wore the same 3 suits on rotation." Vivian's voice carried no self-pity, just matter-of-fact recounting. "When I had enough capital, I started my own firm. It nearly failed the first year. I was 28 and had no connections, no family money backing me. But I was hungry in a way that trust fund kids weren't. I needed it to work, and it did," Julian said softly. "It did. Beyond what I'd imagined possible." She turned to look at him directly. "But success came with a price. I worked 18-hour days for years. Lost relationships because I chose deals over dinners, chose growth over connection. By the time I looked up, I was 43 and successful and completely alone. That's when Dennis found you." "That's when I asked Dennis to help me." Vivian smiled slightly. "I've known him through business circles for years. When I finally admitted I wanted something more than quarterly reports and board meetings, he suggested I meet someone who understood what it meant to build a life around something that mattered. Me, you." Vivian reached across the counter to take his hand. "He told me you'd spent over a decade raising your son alone, that you'd sacrificed your own comfort to give him stability, that you were one of the most genuine people he knew." That sounded like someone worth knowing. Julian squeezed her hand, understanding clicking into place. "You weren't looking for someone with money. I have money. I wanted someone with character. Someone who understood that the most valuable things can't be purchased." She paused. "Someone who sees me, not my bank account." "I do see you," Julian said. "And what I see scares me sometimes." "Why?" "Because you're extraordinary. You built something from nothing, provided for your family, created opportunities that didn't exist before you made them. And I'm a high school teacher who fixes sinks on weekends to make ends meet. The gap between us feels enormous." Vivian stood and moved around the counter to stand in front of him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Julian, you raised a remarkable human being by yourself. You get up every day and teach kids who mostly don't appreciate it because you believe education matters. You work extra jobs not for yourself, but to give your son opportunities. That's not just anything. That's heroic. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels like survival. That's what makes it heroic. She leaned down to kiss him gently. You did what needed to be done without complaint and without recognition. That's character. That's what I value. Julian pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. I'm falling for you. That terrifies me, but it's true. Good. Vivian's smile was warm and real. Because I'm already there. They spent the morning together in comfortable intimacy, talking and laughing and simply being present with each other. Around noon, Julian reluctantly said he needed to go home, check on Kieran, handle the weekend routine that was his normal life. Come back tonight? Vivian asked as she walked him to the elevator. Bring Kieran if he wants. We could order pizza, watch a movie. Nothing fancy. He'd like that. So would I. The kiss goodbye lingered, neither of them quite ready to break the connection. When Julian finally left, stepping back into the elevator with its mirrored walls, he caught his reflection and was surprised by what he saw. He looked happy. The lines around his eyes seemed softer, his posture more relaxed. This was what hope looked like. At home, he found Kieran already back from his friend's house, sprawled on the couch with his laptop. How was gaming night? Julian asked. Long. We made it to level 47 before crashing around 4 in the morning. Kieran looked up with a knowing smile. How was your evening? Good, really good. Julian sat down beside his son. Vivian invited us both over tonight. Pizza and a movie. You interested? Sure. Kieran closed his laptop. Dad, can I ask you something? Always. Are you happy? Like actually happy, not just okay happy? The question was so direct, so earnest, that Julian took a moment to consider his answer carefully. I am, he said finally. For the first time in a very long time, I feel like I'm not just going through motions. Like there's something to look forward to beyond making sure bills are paid and you're taken care of. That's good. Kieran nodded seriously. You deserve that. And Vivian seems like someone who actually gets you, which is important. When did you get so wise? I've been watching you my whole life. Kieran's voice was gentle. I know what sacrifice looks like. I know what it means that you put everything aside for me. But I'm not a little kid anymore, Dad. I want you to have your own life too. Julian pulled his son into a hug, grateful beyond words for this remarkable person he'd raised. Thank you. That evening, the three of them sat in Vivian's living room with pizza boxes spread across the coffee table, arguing good-naturedly about which movie to watch. Kieran lobbied for a sci-fi thriller, Vivian suggested a mystery, and Julian ended up being the tiebreaker, choosing the mystery to Kieran's dramatic protests. Halfway through the film, Julian glanced over to find Kieran actually engaged in the story, making comments that made Vivian laugh. On his other side, Vivian had her hand resting comfortably on his knee, her attention split between the screen and the conversation. This, Julian thought, was what family could look like. Not the same as what he'd had with Margot, but something new and equally valuable. Different shapes of love, different configurations of home. You okay? Vivian whispered, noticing his distraction. Yeah, Julian whispered back. I really am. Later, after they'd dropped Kieran at home and Julian had returned to Vivian's apartment, she asked him the question he'd been expecting. What happens next? With us, I mean. Julian considered carefully. I want to keep seeing you. I want to see where this goes. But I need you to understand that my life is complicated. I have Kieran. I have my work. I have responsibilities I can't just set aside. I'm not asking you to set anything aside. Vivian curled against him on the couch, her head on his shoulder. I'm asking to be part of it. All of it, the complicated parts included. Even the parts where I sometimes have to cancel because Kieran needs something, or where I can't afford expensive dates or trips. Especially those parts. Because those are the parts that matter. She lifted her head to look at him. I don't want to be separate from your real life, Julian. I want to be in it. He kissed her then, slow and certain, and let himself believe that maybe this was possible after all. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, certified mail requiring Julian's signature. He'd been home for less than an hour, still wearing his teaching clothes, when the postal worker knocked. The return address meant nothing to him, a law firm in Connecticut he'd never heard of. Inside was a document with language that made his blood run cold. Petition for custody modification, filed by Gerald and Patricia Whitmore, regarding the minor child Kieran Whitmore Cross, Margot's parents, seeking custody of his son. Julian read the document 3 times, his hands shaking, unable to process what he was seeing. The claims were laid out in cold legal language: inadequate financial resources, unsuitable living conditions, inability to provide opportunities commensurate with the child's needs and potential. They were calling him an unfit father. The room seemed to tilt around him. Julian sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the papers spread before him like evidence of his failure. 12 years. 12 years of doing everything right, of sacrificing everything for Kieran, and this was how they saw him. Poor, inadequate, not enough. The door to Kieran's room opened. His son emerged, took one look at Julian's face, and stopped. "Dad, what's wrong?" Julian tried to find words and discovered his throat had closed. He pushed the papers across the table instead. Kieran read quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to anger. "This is insane. They can't do this." "Apparently they can." Julian's voice sounded distant to his own ears. "They've hired a lawyer. A good one based on this letterhead. But why? They barely even know me. They send a birthday card once a year, and that's it." Kieran sat down across from him, his hands clenched into fists. "I don't want to live with them. I want to stay here, with you. What you want might not matter if they can prove I can't provide adequately. That's garbage. You've provided everything I've ever needed. I've provided what I could afford." Julian gestured around their modest apartment, which apparently isn't enough in their eyes. "They're talking about educational opportunities, extracurricular activities, cultural exposure, all the things money can buy that I can't give you." Kieran's face flushed with anger. "I don't care about any of that. You think I want to live in some big house with strangers who only decided they wanted me now? Where were they when I was 4 and Mom died? Where were they every year after that?" The question hung between them, sharp and unanswerable. Margot's parents had been disapproving of Julian from the start. He hadn't come from the right background, didn't have the right pedigree. After Margot's death, they'd made a few cursory attempts at contact before essentially disappearing from their grandson's life. Now suddenly, they wanted custody. Julian's phone rang. Dennis. He let it go to voicemail, unable to face conversation. But it rang again immediately, and this time Julian answered. "I just heard," Dennis said without preamble. "Gerald Whitmore called my office this afternoon. He's using connections to gather information about you. Work history, financial records, living situation." "Julian, this is serious. I know it's serious. I'm holding the petition in my hands. You need a lawyer." "A good one," Julian laughed, the sound brittle. "With what money?" "I've got maybe 3,000 in savings. That won't even cover a retainer for the kind of attorney who could go up against what they can afford. Then we figure something out. I can loan you." "I can't take your money, Dennis. Then what are you going to do? Represent yourself and hope for the best?" Julian didn't have an answer. The weight of impossibility pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. After he hung up, Kieran was watching him with an expression that broke Julian's heart, fear mixed with determination. The look of a child trying to be brave for a parent who was falling apart. "We'll figure this out," Kieran said, with more confidence than the situation warranted. "We always do." But Julian wasn't sure there was a way to figure this out. Not when the other side had resources he couldn't match, when the legal system measured adequacy in terms of bank accounts and zip codes. He didn't tell Vivian. For 3 days, he carried the weight of it alone, responding to her texts with forced normalcy, cancelling their weekend plans with a vague excuse about work. He couldn't bear to tell her, couldn't stand the thought of her pity or, worse, her offer to help. This was his problem, his failure. His inadequacy laid bare in legal documents, but Vivian knew him well enough by now to sense when something was wrong. On Friday evening, she showed up at his apartment unannounced, concern clear in her expression. "What's going on?" she asked when he opened the door. "And don't tell me nothing. You've been distant all week. Julian wanted to turn her away, to protect her from this mess. But the exhaustion of carrying it alone finally broke through his resistance. "Come in," he said quietly. They sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd first read the petition, and Julian handed her the documents. Vivian read in silence, her expression growing more serious with each page. "When did this arrive?" she asked finally. "Tuesday. And you didn't tell me?" "What was I supposed to say?" "That Margot's parents think I'm too poor to raise my own son." "That they're probably right?" Julian's voice cracked. "You've seen my life, Vivian. This apartment, my salary, the way I have to work extra jobs just to keep ahead of bills. They're going to walk into court and prove that I can't give Kieran what he deserves. That's not what this says." Vivian set down the papers, her voice sharp. "This says they think money equals parenting. It doesn't. In court it might. Not if you have proper legal representation." Vivian pulled out her phone, already scrolling through contacts. "I know someone. Beverly Chen. She's a family law specialist, one of the best in the state. Let me call her. Vivian, I can't afford. I'm not asking you to afford anything. Let me help." Julian stood abruptly, moving to the window, unable to look at her. "I can't take your money. Don't you see how that makes everything worse? I'm already not enough. I'm not going to become the guy who needs his girlfriend to solve his problems. This isn't about your pride, Julian. This is about Kieran. It's about both." He turned to face her. "If I take your money, if I let you fix this, then what am I? The Whitmores are right. I'm the poor guy who can't provide for his own son without help." Vivian stood and crossed to him, her expression fierce. "You've been providing for Kieran alone for 12 years. You've given him a home, stability, love, everything that actually matters. The Whitmores disappeared from his life, and now they want him back because, why? Guilt? Some late-blooming sense of duty? That's not parenting. But they have resources I don't. They can give him opportunities. He doesn't want their opportunities. He wants you." Vivian took his hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I've spent time with Kieran. I've seen how he looks at you, how he talks about you. That boy loves you. He doesn't care about your bank account. He cares that you show up for him every single day." Julian felt tears burning behind his eyes. "What if it's not enough? What if the court decides money matters more than... Then we fight harder, together." Vivian's voice softened. "Julian, I'm not offering to fix this for you. I'm offering to stand beside you while you fight. There's a difference. Let me help. Not because you need saving, but because people who care about each other help when it matters." The resistance in Julian crumbled. He'd been carrying this alone for so long, not just this week, but for 12 years, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to share the weight. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." Vivian pulled him into an embrace, and Julian finally let himself break, the fear and exhaustion of the week pouring out. She held him through it, solid and steady, and when he finally pulled back, she was already making calls. Beverly Chen agreed to meet them Monday morning. Vivian explained the situation in clear, concise terms, and Julian could hear the attorney's professional interest sharpening. After Vivian hung up, she turned to Julian with determination in her eyes. "We're going to win this, not because of money, but because you're the right parent for Kieran. Everything else is just details." Julian wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. Because the alternative, losing his son, was unthinkable. That night after Vivian left, Julian went into Kieran's room. His son was at his desk, supposedly doing homework, but obviously distracted. "We're going to fight this," Julian said from the doorway. "And we're going to win." Kieran looked up, hope and fear warring in his expression. "Promise?" Julian thought about all the promises he'd made over the years. To keep Kieran safe, to give him a good life, to be enough, and realized he couldn't guarantee this one. But he could promise to try. "I promise I'll do everything in my power to keep us together," he said. "Everything," Kieran nodded, accepting the nuance. "That's all I need." But later, alone in his room with Margot's photograph in his hands, Julian wondered if trying would be enough, if love could outweigh resources, if being a good father would matter more than being a financially stable one. He'd find out soon enough. Beverly Chen's office occupied the 15th floor of a building overlooking the harbor. She was in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put Julian at ease. When Vivian had called her, she'd agreed to take the case pro bono as a personal favor, though Julian suspected there was more to it than simple friendship. "I've reviewed the petition," Beverly said, spreading documents across her conference table. Monday morning sunlight streamed through the windows, making the legal papers seem less threatening somehow. The Whitmores have a weak case, but they're banking on two things: their resources and the court's tendency to favor stability and opportunity. So they're banking on everything that matters, Julian said quietly. Not everything. Beverly leaned forward, her expression intent. Family law has evolved significantly. Courts now prioritize the child's established relationships and emotional well-being over financial considerations. Kieran has spent 12 years with you as his primary parent. That bond matters more than their bank account, but they'll argue I can't provide. They'll argue financial limitations. We'll counter with emotional stability, educational success, and most importantly, Kieran's own wishes. He's 16, old enough for the court to seriously consider his preference. Beverly pulled out a legal pad. Tell me about your relationship with Kieran. Everything. The daily routines, the important moments, how you've supported his development. For the next 2 hours, Julian talked. He described their morning rituals, the way they navigated disagreements, Kieran's academic achievements and personal growth. He explained how they'd built a life together after Margot's death, creating stability through consistency and love, even when resources were tight. Beverly took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her expression revealing nothing. When Julian finished, she sat back and studied him thoughtfully. "You're a good father," she said simply. "That's going to be our entire case. Not that you're adequate despite financial limitations, but that you're exactly what Kieran needs because of who you are as a person." Over the following days, Beverly assembled their defense with meticulous care. She interviewed Kieran, who spoke passionately about wanting to stay with Julian. She contacted character witnesses: Dennis, Julian's colleagues at school, neighbors who'd watched Julian raise his son alone. She requested academic records showing Kieran's consistent excellence, documentation of his extracurricular involvement, evidence of a stable, nurturing home environment. "The Whitmores will paint a picture of what money can buy," Beverly explained during one strategy session. "Private schools, tutors, travel opportunities. We're painting a picture of what money can't buy. Dedicated parenting, emotional support, genuine relationship." Julian took on extra handyman jobs in the evenings, driven by the need to demonstrate financial initiative. Vivian protested, worried he was exhausting himself, but he couldn't stop. Every additional dollar earned felt like armor against the Whitmores' accusations. "You're running yourself ragged," Vivian said one night, finding him at his kitchen table at 11 p.m., reviewing financial documents Beverly had requested. "You need rest. I need to prove I can provide." Julian didn't look up from the spreadsheet tracking his income and expenses. "They're going to put everything under a microscope. Every late payment, every month I came up short. I need to show I'm trying." "You've been trying for 12 years. Vivian sat beside him, gently closing his laptop. "Julian, you can't win this by working yourself to death. Beverly doesn't need you to suddenly become wealthy. She needs you to be the father you've always been. What if that's not enough?" It will be. But even Vivian's confidence couldn't completely erase his fear. Kieran had his own way of processing the stress. He threw himself into his schoolwork with renewed intensity, as if perfect grades could somehow prove his father's worth. He started a letter to the court, his own testimony, writing and rewriting it until the words captured everything he felt. One evening he showed it to Julian. The letter was 3 pages long, typed and formatted properly, every sentence carefully crafted. It began simply, "My father has given me everything that matters." Julian read through, tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by his son's words. Kieran described their life together with painful honesty. The times they'd struggled financially, the sacrifices Julian had made, the ways those struggles had taught him values money couldn't purchase. He wrote about mornings before school and evenings doing homework together, about his father attending every academic competition and school event, about feeling loved and supported every single day of his life. Julian couldn't finish the sentence. He pulled Kieran into a tight embrace. "Thank you." "I'm just telling the truth," Kieran said, his voice muffled against his father's shoulder. "You're the best dad I could have asked for. I need them to know that." Beverly incorporated the letter into their case materials, calling it one of the most powerful pieces of evidence she'd seen. "Judges are human," she explained. "This shows them what really matters, the relationship you've built." As the hearing date approached, Dennis organized character witnesses, coordinating schedules to ensure maximum attendance. Julian's principal agreed to testify about his dedication as a teacher and the respect he commanded from students and colleagues. Mrs. Kowalski from down the hall offered to speak about how Julian had helped her repeatedly without expecting payment, how she'd watched him raise Kieran with patience and love. Even Kieran's guidance counselor volunteered a statement about his emotional stability and academic success. "You've built a community," Beverly told Julian during their final preparation meeting. "That's what they're going to see. Not a struggling single parent, but someone who's created a support system and raised a remarkable young man within it." Vivian was careful to maintain appropriate distance from the legal preparations. She attended strategy sessions when invited, but never pushed her way into decisions. She understood instinctively that Julian needed to own this fight, that his sense of adequacy as a father depended on defending his role himself. But she was there in the quiet moments. When Julian woke at 3 a.m. in a panic, she talked him through it over the phone. When he doubted himself, she reminded him of his strength. When the weight became too heavy, she simply sat beside him in silence, a steady presence against the storm. "I'm terrified," Julian admitted one evening, 5 days before the hearing. They were at his apartment, Kieran asleep in his room. "What if I lose him?" "You won't." Vivian took his hand. "But if you need to hear it, if the absolute worst happens, I will help you appeal. We will keep fighting until we win. You won't face this alone." The promise settled something in Julian's chest. Not the fear, that remained sharp and constant, but the isolation. For 12 years, every crisis had been his to solve alone. Having someone beside him, genuinely invested in his well-being and Kieran's, made the impossible feel slightly less insurmountable. 2 days before the hearing, the Whitmore's attorney sent a settlement offer. They would drop the custody petition if Julian agreed to a formal visitation schedule, giving them access to Kieran for extended periods. Summers, holidays, school breaks. "It's a trap," Beverly said when Julian brought her the document. "They're betting you'll be so afraid of losing that you'll agree to terms that essentially let them parent Kieran part-time without having to prove their case. But if we lose in court, I get nothing. If we lose in court, which we won't, you have grounds for appeal. If you sign this, you're giving away rights voluntarily. Once signed, it's binding." Beverly looked at him seriously. "Do you trust me?" Julian thought about Kieran's letter, about the testimony they'd prepared, about 12 years of showing up every day. "Yes." "Then we go to court. We tell your story. We let them see what a real parent looks like." Beverly's confidence was unshakable. "Trust the process." The night before the hearing, Julian couldn't sleep. He moved quietly through the apartment, trying not to wake Kieran. In the kitchen, he found himself staring at the wooden box on top of the microwave, the one holding Kieran's baby shoes. He opened it, taking out the tiny leather shoes worn soft with age, and marveled again at how something so small had grown into someone so extraordinary. His phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. "Can't sleep either. Thinking of you." Julian smiled despite his anxiety and typed back, "Same. Thank you for everything. You're going to win tomorrow. Because you deserve to. Because Kieran needs you. Because you're exactly the father he's supposed to have." He wanted to believe her. Needed to believe her. Everything he'd built, everything he was, came down to tomorrow. Julian made coffee at 4 a.m., watching the city wake through his kitchen window. Somewhere out there, the Whitmores were preparing their case, marshalling their resources, readying arguments about what money could provide. They would walk into that courtroom with confidence born of privilege, certain that wealth equaled worthiness. But Julian had something they didn't. He had Kieran's unwavering love. He had 12 years of daily proof that he was enough. He had a community willing to testify on his behalf. And he had the truth that being a parent meant more than writing checks and providing opportunities. It meant showing up every single day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. When Kieran emerged from his room at 6, already dressed in the suit they'd bought second-hand for the hearing, father and son looked at each other with understanding that required no words. "Ready?" Kieran asked. Julian thought about everything that question encompassed. Was he ready to defend his worth as a father? To stand before a judge and prove that love mattered more than money? To risk everything on the hope that the system would see what really counted? "Ready," he said. They would face this together. Whatever came next, they would face it as they always had, as a team, as family, as two people who'd chosen each other every day for 12 years and weren't about to stop now. The courthouse was everything Julian had imagined, and worse. Cold marble floors, high ceilings that swallowed sound, and hallways filled with people whose lives were being decided by strangers in black robes. He and Kieran sat on a bench outside the courtroom, both of them silent, Beverly reviewing notes beside them. Vivian had offered to attend, but Julian had gently declined. This felt too intimate, too raw to have her witness. She'd understood, though her hug that morning had conveyed everything she couldn't say. At 9:30, the Whitmores arrived. Gerald was tall and silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Julian's monthly rent. Patricia was elegant in a way that spoke of country clubs and charity galas, her pearls understated but unmistakably real. They didn't acknowledge Julian or Kieran, moving past them as if they were invisible. "Breathe," Beverly murmured. "Remember, they have money. You have truth." The courtroom itself was smaller than Julian expected, more intimate. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and an expression that revealed nothing. Beverly had called her fair but exacting, someone who cared more about facts than theatrics. The Whitmore's attorney spoke first. His name was Richard Beaumont, and everything about him radiated expensive competence. He laid out their case with clinical precision. Gerald and Patricia Whitmore, successful business owners with substantial assets, seeking custody of their grandson to provide opportunities his current guardian could not afford. "The petitioners love their grandson," Beaumont said, his voice smooth and practiced. "They recognize that Mr. Cross has done his best under difficult circumstances. But best effort and best outcome are not the same thing. Kieran is a bright young man with exceptional potential. The Whitmores can provide private education, college preparation, cultural experiences, and financial security that his current situation simply cannot match." Beaumont presented financial records, the Whitmores' substantial assets compared to Julian's modest income, documentation of their home, a 6-bedroom estate in Connecticut with grounds and amenities, letters from prestigious private schools expressing interest in Kieran's enrollment. "This is not about love," Beaumont continued. "No one disputes that Mr. Cross cares for his son. But caring is not enough. Kieran deserves every advantage, every opportunity. The Whitmores can provide that. Mr. Cross, through no fault of his own, cannot." Julian felt each word like a physical blow. The arguments were logical, reasonable, devastating. He glanced at Kieran, who sat rigid beside him, jaw clenched. When it was Beverly's turn, she stood with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, the petitioners would have you believe this case is about resources. It's not. It's about relationship. It's about 12 years of daily devoted parenting versus sudden interest from grandparents who were largely absent from this child's life." Beverly called her first witness, Dennis. He spoke about knowing Julian since college, watching him navigate sudden single parenthood with grace and dedication. "Julian didn't just survive those years," Dennis testified. "He thrived. He showed up for Kieran every single day. School events, doctor appointments, late-night homework sessions. I've never seen someone more committed to being a good father." The Whitmore's attorney cross-examined briefly, establishing that Dennis was a close friend whose testimony might be biased. Dennis didn't flinch. "I'm biased toward the truth," he said simply. "And the truth is, Julian has been an exceptional father." Next came Julian's principal, who described his dedication as a teacher and the respect he commanded from students and colleagues. Mr. Cross brings the same commitment to his classroom that he brings to parenting. Consistent, thoughtful, genuinely invested in the success of those in his care. Mrs. Kowalski testified about the neighbor she'd watched raise Kieran alone, never complaining, always kind. "That boy is polite, respectful, happy. You don't get that from money. You get that from good parenting." The guidance counselor spoke about Kieran's emotional stability, his academic excellence, his clear sense of being loved and supported. "In my 15 years at Roosevelt High, I've seen hundreds of students. Kieran stands out not because of privilege, but because he's been given something more valuable, consistent, nurturing parenting." Each witness chipped away at the Whitmore's narrative, replacing it with something more substantial, not wealth but worth, not opportunity but actual parenting. Then Beverly called Julian to the stand. His hands shook as he took the oath. The courtroom felt too bright, too exposed. But when he looked at Kieran, his son's expression, proud, trusting, certain, steadied him. Beverly's questions were straightforward. "Describe your relationship with Kieran. How did you manage as a single parent? What challenges did you face?" Julian told the truth. He described the early years after Margot's death, the grief, the fear, the overwhelming responsibility of raising a 4-year-old alone. He talked about establishing routines, creating stability, making their modest apartment feel like home. "There were times I didn't know if I was doing it right," Julian admitted. "Times I worried I wasn't enough. But I showed up. Every morning, every evening, every moment Kieran needed me, I was there." Beverly introduced evidence, teaching awards, Kieran's report cards showing consistent academic excellence, letters from coaches and club advisors praising Kieran's character and work ethic. "Mr. Cross," Beverly said, her voice gentle but firm, "the petitioners argue you cannot provide opportunities." "How do you respond?" Julian took a breath. "I've provided everything that matters. Love, support, guidance, stability. I've worked multiple jobs to ensure Kieran has what he needs. Not what money can buy, but what actually builds a person. Values, work ethic, kindness, resilience. The Whitmores can offer expensive schools and fancy trips. I've offered something more valuable, a father who's present, engaged, and devoted to his well-being every single day." He saw Gerald Whitmore shift uncomfortably. Patricia's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested his words had landed. Beaumont's cross-examination was sharp. He pressed on finances, late utility payments, the need for weekend handyman work, the modest apartment. Each question designed to highlight inadequacy. "Mr. Cross, do you deny that your income is significantly below the Whitmores?" "No." "Do you deny that you've struggled financially while raising Kieran?" "I don't deny struggling. I deny that struggle equals failure." Julian met Beaumont's eyes steadily. "I've given my son a home filled with love and support. That's not inadequacy. That's success." Beverly redirected, giving Julian the chance to present one final piece of evidence. He pulled a worn journal from his jacket, Margot's journal from the year before she died. "My wife kept this. She wrote about our dreams for Kieran, her hopes for his future." Julian's voice caught. "May I read an entry?" Judge Morrison nodded. Julian opened to a page marked with a faded ribbon. March 15th. "Watched Julian with Kieran today at the park. The way he listens, really listens when our son talks. The patience he shows teaching him to tie his shoes for the 100th time. If anything ever happens to me, I know Kieran will be okay. Because Julian is exactly the father our son needs. Present, patient, endlessly loving. Some men provide financially. Julian provides everything else." His voice broke on the last words. "She trusted me to raise our son. For 12 years I've honored that trust." The courtroom was silent. Julian saw Patricia Whitmore wipe her eyes quickly. Beverly called Kieran to the stand as her final witness. He walked forward with steady purpose, his hand firm as he took the oath. Julian watched his son, No longer the 4-year-old who'd clung to him after Margot's funeral, but a young man who'd grown into someone remarkable. "Kieran," Beverly began gently, "tell the court about your relationship with your father." Kieran looked directly at the judge, his voice clear and unwavering. "My dad is my hero, not because he's perfect or rich or can buy me everything, but because he's been there every single day of my life. When I was scared, when I needed help, when I just wanted someone to listen, he was always there." "What about your grandparents?" "The Whitmores? I barely know them." Kieran's honesty was stark. "They send a birthday card once a year. That's it. Now suddenly they want custody? It feels like they're trying to fix guilt, not build a relationship." Beaumont objected to the characterization, but Judge Morrison allowed it with a stern look. "The witness may share his perspective," Beverly continued. "If the court granted custody to your grandparents, how would that affect you?" "It would destroy me." Kieran's voice cracked slightly. "My dad and I are a team. We've been through everything together. Moving me to Connecticut with people I don't know, away from my school and friends, and the life we've built. That's not helping me. That's punishing both of us for not having enough money." He pulled out his letter, asking permission to read it. The judge nodded. Kieran read steadily, his words painting a picture of their life together. "The morning routines before school. The way Julian attended every academic competition, cheering louder than anyone else. How they navigated tough conversations about Kieran's mother, about grief, about growing up. The sacrifices Julian made quietly, going without, so Kieran could have what he needed. My dad taught me that being rich means having people who love you, not having money in the bank," Kieran concluded. "He's the richest person I know, and I don't want to lose him." When Beaumont cross-examined, he tried to paint a picture of better opportunities with the Whitmores. Private tutors, prep schools, connections that could open doors. "Don't you want those advantages, Kieran?" "Not if they cost me my father." Kieran's response was immediate. "There's no advantage worth that. But surely you recognize that your grandparents could provide things your father cannot." "They can provide money." "My dad provides everything else." Kieran looked at Julian, his expression fierce with loyalty. "I choose him. I'll always choose him." The courtroom fell silent. Even Beaumont seemed momentarily at a loss. Gerald Whitmore took the stand next. He spoke about their estate, their resources, their desire to honor Margot's memory by raising her son. But under Beverly's cross-examination, cracks appeared. "Mr. Whitmore, when did you last see Kieran before filing this petition?" Gerald hesitated. "It's been several years." "How many years?" "Perhaps 6 or 7. "And in those 6 or 7 years, how many times did you attempt to visit?" "We sent cards." "How many visits, Mr. Whitmore?" "None." His voice was quiet. "We thought it best to give Julian space to grieve." 7 years of space. "And now, when Kieran is 16 and nearly grown, you suddenly want custody." "Why now?" Gerald struggled to answer. "Finally," he said quietly, "we realize we made a mistake. We let grief keep us from our grandson. We want to fix that by taking him from the only parent he's known for 12 years, by giving him opportunities that he doesn't want." Beverly's voice was sharp. "Mr. Whitmore, has Kieran ever expressed any desire to live with you?" "No." "Has he ever complained about his living situation with his father?" "Not to us, but has he ever indicated he felt deprived or neglected?" Gerald looked at Kieran, who met his gaze steadily. "No." Judge Morrison called a recess. Julian stepped outside with Kieran and Beverly, his legs shaking with adrenaline. "You were amazing," he told Kieran. And pulling him close, "just told the truth." Kieran's voice was muffled against his shoulder. "Think it was enough?" "It has to be," Beverly said quietly, "because there's nothing more powerful than the truth." When they reconvened, Judge Morrison had made her decision. She looked at both parties, her expression grave. "I've heard compelling arguments from both sides. The Whitmores can certainly provide financial advantages, but this court recognizes that parenting is measured not in dollars, but in dedication, consistency, and love. Kieran has thrived under his father's care. He's academically successful, emotionally stable, and unequivocal in his desire to remain with Julian Cross. Most significantly, Mr. Cross has been the constant, devoted parent for 12 years. While the petitioners were largely absent, Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. Custody will remain with Julian Cross. However, I'm ordering a visitation schedule that allows the Whitmores regular contact with their grandson, monthly visits, and reasonable holiday time. This family needs healing, not separation. Relief crashed over Julian so intensely, his vision blurred. Kieran grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. Beverly smiled, satisfied. Gerald and Patricia stood to leave. But Patricia stopped, turning to look at Kieran and Julian. "We were wrong," she said softly, her voice breaking. "About so many things, but especially about you, Julian. Margot chose well. Then they were gone, and it was over." 2 months after the hearing, Julian stood in his kitchen making breakfast with a lightness he hadn't felt in years. The weight that had pressed against his chest since that terrible Tuesday when the petition arrived had finally lifted. The apartment was the same, still modest, still cramped, but it felt different now. It felt secure. Kieran emerged from his room, already dressed for school, and reached past Julian to grab the orange juice. "Morning," his son said, the word carrying the easy comfort of routine restored. "Morning. Sleep okay?" "Yeah. No weird dreams about courtrooms." Kieran grinned. Those finally stopped. They'd both had nightmares in the weeks following the hearing, stress manifesting in unconscious hours. But slowly, normalcy had returned. School, work, their evening routines, the familiar rhythms that had always defined their life together. The visitation schedule with the Whitmores had been awkward at first. That first weekend, Kieran had come home quiet and emotionally drained. But Gerald and Patricia were trying, genuinely trying, to build a relationship rather than impose expectations. They'd learned to ask about Kieran's interests instead of planning activities he didn't want. They'd stopped mentioning private schools and started just being grandparents. "They're not so bad," Kieran had admitted after the third visit. "Kind of formal and weird, but they're trying." Julian had been grateful for that, for the slow healing of fractures he hadn't caused but had inherited. Margot would have wanted her parents in Kieran's life, would have wanted that bridge rebuilt. The doorbell rang. Vivian, right on time. She'd become a fixture in their lives in the months since the hearing, her presence no longer feeling like an intrusion, but like a natural extension of their small family. She understood when to be present and when to give them space, never trying to replace what they had, but adding to it instead. "Good morning," she said, kissing Julian's cheek before turning to Kieran. "Ready for that physics test?" "Born ready." Kieran grabbed his backpack. "Thanks for the study guide last night. That stuff about momentum finally clicked." "Any time. Now go ace that test." After Kieran left, Julian and Vivian sat at the kitchen table with coffee, a morning ritual they'd fallen into without discussion. Vivian had stopped trying to convince him to stay at her penthouse, understanding that this apartment was home in ways her expensive space could never be. "I've been thinking," Vivian said, wrapping her hands around her mug, "about something I want to run by you. No pressure, just consideration." Julian recognized that tone. Something important. "Okay, I've been looking at houses. Real houses, not apartments or penthouses. 3 bedrooms, good school district, yard for absolutely nothing except having a yard." She watched his reaction carefully. "For us, all 3 of us." Julian's heart rate picked up. "Vivian, I'm not trying to fix your life or prove I have money. I'm trying to build something with you. A home that's ours, not mine or yours, but something we create together." She reached across the table to take his hand. "I know it's fast. I know we've only been dating a few months. But I also know what I want. And I want this. You, Kieran. A life we build together." Julian thought about his conversation with Kieran the night before. His son had brought up Vivian unprompted, mentioned how different the apartment felt when she was there. Fuller, warmer, more complete. "What does Kieran think?" he asked. "I haven't said anything to him. This is between us first, but if you're open to it, I'd like us to talk to him together. Make this a family decision. Family, The word settled over Julian with surprising rightness. Not replacement family, not a poor substitute for what he'd lost, but something new and equally valuable. Different shape, same substance. I'd need to contribute, Julian said carefully. I can't just let you buy us a house. That's not... I need to be part of it financially. Then we figure out what works. Maybe you handle utilities and maintenance. Maybe we set up something where you gradually buy in. I don't care about the mechanics, Julian. I care about building something together where everyone feels invested. He looked at her across the table. This woman who'd walked into that cafe expecting nothing and had somehow become essential to his life. Who'd stood beside him through the custody battle without taking over. Who'd learned to love his son. Not as a condition of loving him, but because Kieran was remarkable in his own right. Let's talk to Kieran, he said. Tonight, all three of us. Vivian's smile was radiant. That evening, they gathered in the living room. Kieran sat on the couch between them, looking between his father and Vivian with barely concealed curiosity. So this is either really good news or really bad news, he said, based on how nervous you both look. Julian laughed despite his nerves. Vivian has something she wants to discuss with both of us. She explained about the house, about wanting to build a life together, about making this a joint decision. Kieran listened with an expression that started skeptical and shifted to something more open. You're talking about moving in together, he asked. Like permanent? Eventually, yes, Vivian said. If that's something you're comfortable with. Your opinion matters, Kieran. This affects your life as much as ours. Kieran was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Can I ask you something? Anything. Are you doing this because you feel sorry for us? Because we don't have much? No. Vivian's answer was immediate and firm. I'm doing this because your father is the kindest, most genuine person I've ever met. Because you're an incredible young man I'm honored to know. Because when I imagine my future, you're both in it. Not as a project or a charity case, but as the family I choose. Family, Kieran repeated softly. Then he looked at Julian. What do you think, Dad? I think I'm terrified and hopeful in equal measure, Julian admitted. This is new territory for both of us. But I also think... He glanced at Vivian, then back to his son. I think your mum would approve, not of replacing her, because that's impossible, but of moving forward, of being open to happiness again. Kieran nodded slowly. Okay, let's do it. Let's look at houses. The relief and joy that flooded through Julian was almost overwhelming. 3 weeks later, they stood in the backyard of a house in a quiet neighborhood, 20 minutes from Julian's school. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with enough space for all of them to cook together, and a yard that Kieran immediately started planning to convert into a workshop space. It needs work, Julian said, noting the repairs required. Good thing I know an excellent handyman, Vivian replied, linking her arm through his. Kieran was already measuring spaces, planning, making the house theirs in his mind. Julian watched. His son, this remarkable person he'd raised, and felt the same overwhelming gratitude he'd felt the day Kieran was born. Everything they'd been through, every struggle and sacrifice, had led to this moment. On the back porch, away from where Kieran was exploring, Julian pulled Vivian close. Thank you, he said quietly, for seeing past the circumstances to the person, for choosing us. Thank you for taking a chance on one more blind date. Vivian smiled up at him. Best decision Dennis ever made. That evening, back at the apartment, Julian took out the wooden box from the top of the microwave. Inside were Kieran's baby shoes, worn soft and small, representing everything he'd carried for 12 years. He held them for a moment, acknowledging the past, then carefully closed the box. Tomorrow he would start packing. They'd begin the process of moving forward, of building something new while honoring what had been. The shoes would come with them, a reminder of the journey that had brought them here. But tonight, he stood at his kitchen window watching the city lights, Vivian beside him and Kieran safe in the next room, and allowed himself to feel something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. not just for survival or stability, but for actual happiness. For a future built not on what they lacked, but on what they'd found: connection, love, family in its truest form. Julian reached for Vivian's hand, threading his fingers through hers, and smiled at the life waiting ahead of them. It wouldn't be perfect. There would be challenges, adjustments, moments of doubt, but they would face them together, and that, Julian realized, was everything.